afternoon, good evening to those who are in the Far East. I know we have a few, and Middle East. My name is Elliot Heilpern. I'm Membership Director of the Payments Business, and can I welcome you to our Biometrics webinar, a very exciting topic and very apposite for the banking and payments environment. Before I hand over to our moderator, Bob Ford, and our three excellent biometrics panelists, a little bit about the payments business for those of you who don't know. We are a networking forum where we provide information and partnership opportunities to those involved in the UK and overseas payments environment. And that includes payments that cover both retail, wholesale, and corporate banking. So we get into some of the more sophisticated treasury management type products as well. And the partnership opportunities we provide offer good revenue earning opportunities for our members and for our partners. So we'd be delighted to work with you on that. We also have an educational academy now that talks about a whole raft of different issues in the industry. And we will be espousing some of the courses very shortly. And ultimately, the networking forum allows for a very interactive discussion through webinars such as this, seminars, and thought leadership forums. So if you have a chance, do look at our website and see the detail at the end of the video, at the end of the webinar, should I say, and we'd be delighted to welcome you. And on that note, I just want to say before I hand over to my colleague and moderator, Bob Ford, we will be video recording this webinar. So if you miss anything, we will be sending it out to all our membership, all the attendees, and all our partners. To the topic at hand, biometrics, a very quick definition from me before I do hand over. It's all about authentication, which presumably makes the whole element of security and identity much faster and easier. And it's based on physical characteristics, human characteristics. It could be fingerprints, it could be your iris and your eye, voice, my voice is my word, total facial type patterns. Very interesting combination of different facial and general character identification elements, if you like. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Some of you may be aware, you may be using it when you touch your phone, fingerprint, facial recognition. I mentioned my voice is my password or passcode. And then, of course, at airports where you put your passport. So it's an exciting webinar. Lots of questions I'm sure you have, which you'll have an opportunity to answer at the end. But without any further ado from me, as Membership Director and on behalf of our CEO, John Doyle, I welcome you again. And I hand over now to Bob Ford, our moderator, who will introduce the panelists. We'll have an active debate, and I do hope and trust an active question and answer session. Thank you so much, Bob.
Thanks, Elliot. Good day, everybody. Welcome to the latest webinar. And what we'd like to do is to try and get the debate and discussion going. And so we've created a hashtag for the webinar, #TPB webinar. It's on the bottom of the slide. You know, if you can start tweeting about that, interesting comments you may hear from our speakers, thoughts, observations. Let's try and get the debate going as a result of today. And if you've got questions, again, put them up using that hashtag. Gives us a chance to bring out the debate, maybe ask specific questions to our panelists. So let's get it going. I think, as Elliot said, over the last few years, we've become more and more entangled as a society with biometrics. We've got thumbprints, facial recognitions, just to unlock our phones and to make payments. And I'm often amazed just how well my phone manages to pick up my face, even in the dark. I'm impressed. And you get the dichotomy of those people who complain about government oversight and yet are quite happy to have their thumbprint logged in their phone. John's just reminded me, forgive me, another way of being able to enter into the debate for the day is to use the chat function. So we've got tweeters and we've got chat. So this is going to be better if you're involved. So let's bring it together. Anyway, I'm joined today by three illustrious speakers, presenters, who'll be providing their thoughts on the current and evolving trend in the field of biometrics. Our first speaker, Matthew Key. Matthew's career has been based on an emerging technology. He spent 23 years at BT, followed by 12 in the financial services space, leading innovation for global financial service customers, including Visa, MasterCard, and Lloyds. Matthew's a renowned keynote speaker, blogger, and media commentator. He now consults on emerging technology for the financial sector at keyinnovate.com. So, Matthew, welcome. Given the nature of this subject, which seems to cover a plethora of capabilities, what's your view on where we in the financial sector are with regards to the use of biometrics?
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Bob. You know, we are at a new dawn now, I think, for some fairly obvious reasons. We are increasingly less likely to go to our banks to identify ourselves. We're having to do a lot more online. And to prove our identities online, we are going to use biometrics. Actually, as we speak, I'm trying to sign up to an online business bank, Metal. They're part of the NatWest organization. And it's all completely online. And they're using a couple of biometric indicators to sign me up. So, you know, it's really, really relevant, as many businesses are moving online, whether sole businesses or larger businesses. And of course, the other big news is the government announcement about our renewal when we all start, you know, when the economy starts growing again. I think it's already is, according to some. They're going to increase the contactless limit on cards, debit and credit cards, to £100, and that's just going to really enable you know, businesses, and particularly retail businesses, actually to thrive. But that in itself brings some challenges, clearly, around fraud. So we're going to be seeing a lot more in this space as we move forward. UBS talk about the you know, fingerprint sensor cards being part of the mainstream now, and increasing that up to £6 billion a year by, I think, 2026. And I'm aware that there are 20 trials and some launched of these finger sensor cards out in the marketplace. So it's really vital in the payment space, but actually it's much more wide for all of us, and some of the other speakers will be talking to that. I wanted to sort of step back a little bit and describe, you know, perhaps people are unaware about how much biometrics are playing in our lives already. You've both spoken about, you know, we're familiar with airport passport biometrics. Voice for banking has been around. Voice ID authentication has been around for a long time, as has smartphone fingerprints. But you may not recognize that vein biometrics in the financial world have been around for a long time. BT used them in the trading environment to authenticate, you know, patterns of trade. And Japanese banks have been using vein technologies and aligned technologies for identifying people as they're going to take cash out. So it's really vital that it's happening. And there are many other different methods. I know the other speakers are going to talk about this a wee bit later. But a new one just coming out is ocular. Now, we're probably familiar with iris recognition already, but actually there's a lot more properties of the eye than just the iris. It's the shape of the eye, it's the pigment, it's the whole dimensions in the eye. That's going to be increasingly important. There are other stuff out there that's used around. It's really kind of interesting when you hear about it. Heartbeat, biometric, the heartbeat, that's really relevant. How we type online, the patterns of how we type away and the power that we use. And in fact, even the way we use the keystrokes is unique to us. So, there's a lot happening in this space. The one that sort of really stands out to me, and I know that others are going to be talking about this in more detail, but is really, really highly relevant, is facial recognition and facial verification. And there's some great they happen to be a UK company that others are going to talk about later on that are really pushing the forefront of that. So biometrics is around us all. Perhaps we just don't recognize it. There are different methods, some of which we're familiar with and others that are turning up. But I think the fact that we are moving increasingly online and we need verification is only going to increase the demand for biometrics, aligned with the fact that as we go through the renewal, the contactless cards are going to increase their limit to 100. So they're going to, we're going to need it all. I think at this point, I'll hand back to you, Bob.
Thanks, Matthew. Our second speaker is Richard Baker. Richard's a security innovation architect with over 35 years of experience in IT and security. This has most recently included identity and biometrics, cloud security, the Internet of Things, and zero trust in the BT security team. Here, he was engaged with business units across BT and building collaborative virtual teams to address technical, regulatory, and market challenges. Richard has also contributed to industry and standards groups such as Tech UK, OIX, NIST, NCSC, and DCMS in the areas of identity and zero trust. So, Richard, I will bring in your slide, and there's the mugshot and your slide there. So, having heard what Matthew's explained, how do you consider biometrics can change and enhance the user experience, or is it detrimental?
I certainly agree that it's going to be a key part of this renewal, the digital transformation that we're driving for as we come out of the current environment, and it'll be key over the next couple of years. And I think from my perspective, it will also be key in terms of building user experience, and on the back of that it's going to be key to be building user trust. It's also going to be working in part of evolving marketplaces. So we look within the finance sector, we're seeing open banking starting to move to open finance. So as that overall envelope changes, that's going to be quite interesting in terms of the way the dynamics and the way that identity gets used and reused across different products and different channels is going to be key. But I suppose coming from my architecture perspective, I see that there are going to be a number of system challenges. And I guess with the audience today, what I want to try and do is play out a few of those so that as you're beginning to look at sort of the biometric technologies and how you're going to use it, that you're basically planning for the future. And I think one of the key areas where there's often a lot of confusion, and I know that Frank's going to come back and talk a little bit about this later, is actually there are probably 3 or 4 distinct areas where biometrics are being used, or where we need to have some caution. The first is actually in terms of onboarding. And so this is, how do we actually identify the individual and relate that back to other sort of baseline identity references? So we see discussion about sort of scanning of passports, scanning of driving licenses, as tying back to those original sort of data sources. But that's a very different activity to what will probably be the mainstream use of biometrics, which is actually about that session by session authentication. And so it's, as somebody wants to make a transaction, how do we authenticate them for that specific transaction? But then as that evolves, we then got opportunities for biometrics around, again, this comes back to user experience, and in other areas where we're talking about this context of sort of trying to minimize the user friction, how do we use biometrics to step up the authentication? So we're all familiar with, when I log into my bank, I might enter a username and password, but actually when I then go to set up a new payment or a new payee, I then get another level of checks. And so part of the question is going to be, how does biometrics fit constructively into that sort of step up? And that comes on further on to again what Matthew touched on, which was the behavioral aspect of biometrics, how I type, perhaps more generally about what else I'm doing in the context of the transaction. But one other area I'm going to come back, I'm going to flag up again, is actually also how we build biometric systems to manage things when they go wrong. And because that's we often always think about the nice straight line good case to happy environment. We also need to be thinking about the unhappy environments when the user experiences either sort of things like loss of device or fraud or whatever. How identity fraud, how do we recover? And so in this context, we need to think about a number of things. And first of all, I touched on the fact of the move from open banking to open finance. We need to be thinking about the fact that applications are going to be repurposed. Data is going to be repurposed. So as we build systems, and whether you're building or buying, or you've got that sort of hybrid of that yourself, you need to think about, how is this system going to be, how might this system be repurposed? How might the data be repurposed? And how do I need to think about the security of that data, both in terms of data breach, but also in terms of privacy of the individual, confidentiality, and also thinking about consent as well, because increasingly, as the transactions that we build around these types of systems, where digital identity is becoming increasingly key, consent is also going to be particularly important if we want to start to leverage the repository of data that we're building beyond that initial application that we envisage. So looking on, so another concern often I find gets missed out in terms of this excitement in terms of technology is looking at the diversity of the environments that we're going to be working in. We often start off focusing on, focusing on one particular area, one particular type of user. But as this stuff rolls out, we need to bear in mind that the users in future are no longer going to be early adopters. They're not necessarily just going to be the people who are really interested in experimenting with the new technologies. I live in Ealing, and so some of you are aware, Amazon Fresh have just opened their new sort of biometrics-enabled store. I'm not going to go there because the queues are absolutely enormous. If I want to do some shopping, I'll go to Tesco's or Morrison's. It's going to be a damn sight quicker. So, yeah, we've got some challenge. We've got that sort of incitement and enthusiasm there at the moment. But those are those sorts of issues that we need to think about. But also, some of the work I've been doing with OIX has been thinking about some of the architectural issues, and I'm sure Frank will come back to this in some of his discussions and what he's been working with. But there are perhaps sort of three distinct models in terms of the way that these systems are being built. There are centralized systems, there are decentralized systems, and there's also this concept of self-sovereign. And the way that these systems are structured means they're not necessarily automatically interoperable from the wider business sense. We might technically be able to get them to talk to each other, but in terms of the wider business opportunities, we need to be thinking about that. And so those are some of the questions which I would open up. And this brings us on to the issue of increasing complexity. We're going to, and again, Frank will talk about the number of partners which are going to be coming together to actually build these sorts of systems. And that brings a number of challenges. From my perspective, I come from a security background. So that's thinking very much about the wider threat landscape. You've got more partners, you've got more moving parts. Those that provide opportunities for cyber threats, for and also as well as sort of other sort of payment and identity type frauds. So you need to consider how that stuff's going to work together. And we can see this happening already, because even with the conventional sort of cloud services, we can see where companies are trying to build multi-cloud applications. They're beginning to struggle with how you're managing security and monitoring across those multiple platforms. And this is going to be particularly key for payment platforms because of the regulatory requirements that you're going to have to be able to demonstrate in terms of your due diligence. And so you're going to have to think very carefully about what is the information that you want from each of your partners, from a cyber perspective, from a payments perspective, and also from and how that's going to impact your wider business behavior. Also, coming from a digital identity perspective, I suspect we're going to have to think much more about the longevity of the information that we're holding in these systems. And it may well move beyond just something which we're holding for a short period of time, but systems are going to be lasting for many years, potentially many decades, or at least the data that underpins that. I mean, that brings a new set of challenges. And with that, also challenges where we've got people with thin files, so they don't necessarily have the same identity proof. That's going to bring in different challenges in terms of the way that we onboard people. So some of the assumptions that we're making now about biometrics may not always be able to applicable. So we can't discard or deprecate the existing systems. So we're going to have to, these two worlds are going to have to coexist. And that brings us on to another point about evolving behaviors. So as we start to build new systems, we're going to get the systems are going to function in new ways, and we've got to have some challenges to work out whether those new systems are fraudulent. It's actually good activity or fraudulent activity, and biometrics is going to be a key part of that. And particularly as we start to think about what happens when things go wrong. We've talked about the happy situation where people can authenticate themselves and it works. But if I'm on holiday and my bag is stolen and I lose my phone, I lose my passport and my driving license, all in that one theft, for example, how might I go about re-establishing my identity so that I can re-engage and get access to money, potentially get permission to travel again? So as we think about biometrics and think about the systems that we're putting together, how are those systems going to cope in helping somebody get back from that crisis without automatically flagging them as potential fraud? And so that, I think, is some of the challenges that we've got. And I think I'm aware time is passing, so I'll move on. Again, we also need to think about how the risks are changing. And I think here again, perhaps back to the Amazon Fresh story, but also there's the Russian supermarket, which has just reopened, that's talking about pay by face. So that's taking the contactless stuff that Matthew talked about in his introduction about perhaps using biometrics to augment contactless, to taking it to, I'm just going to use my face anyway. And there are challenges there about where is the risk and where is the risk shifting in terms of that transactions. And then my final note here is, again, bringing back to, in those situations with risk, how do we support not just your business, how do we protect not just your business, but the individual, ultimately your customer, in terms of building trust and relationships? Because as we all know from our own personal experience, the real test of relationship with the organization is how they respond to you when things go wrong. And with that, Bob, I'll hand that back to you. And
thank you. Actually, Richard, one of the things that occurred to me as you were sort of coming to your conclusion and talking about the Russian bank. No,
not Russian bank. Did I say
sorry, Russian supermarket. I apologise. But it's quite a fascinating one when you think about it, that most of the banks in the UK have installed cameras with their ATM systems to sort of identify fraudulent transactions, but it's after the event. They actually haven't, or don't appear, as I understand it, to have actually linked that ATM transaction to the camera to say, actually, can you do a biometric validation of the person who's withdrawing this money?
Yeah, and that brings me on to one of my other favorite topics, which is zero trust, which is actually about trying to gather as much information before the session and understand the context of the session, so you can create that appropriate risk assessment. And that can be a risk assessment in terms of the cyber risk, or crucially in terms of payments, it's around the payment and the sort of payment fraud and potentially money laundering.
Yeah.
And that, so yeah, no, it's a really interesting area as you see a number of technologies and business use cases coming together.
Yep. Thank you, Richard. Our final presenter, Frank Joshi. Frank's been deeply involved in the internet since 1994 as both a technologist and as an entrepreneur. Having studied for a BSc in physics, technology became and remains his personal passion. The sheer potential of connecting people was not lost when he began work on his first internet projects, building B2B portals, and it continues to excite. Mvine connects people with each other, with systems, and with applications safely and easily. So Frank, welcome. As regards the platforms where biometric information is held, who owns the platforms that you're using, and who's performing and storing identity verifications against external sources?
Thank you so much, Bob, for that introduction. Brilliant. So in fact, yes, this is where we are after 20 odd years, is effectively the same journey of trying to create secure online B2B or B2B2C ecosystems all around trust. If I may, before answering the specific question as to where some of these components are stored and so on, perhaps I'd like to perhaps start with a little bit of a story, because the whole issue of biometrics, to some scares, to others it's a minefield, to others, why, they don't understand it. But actually, there's not a lot new with regard to biometrics. All it is today is the digital equivalent of what we used to do yesterday. So if we, and as we move to the web, if we can look at the parallels, and sometimes when talking to people about the benefits of biometrics, it's almost to share with people, what did you used to do? Well, you used to turn up to your bank, for example, and sign a bunch of forms and present them with the documents that attested to who you were. You then created a relationship. And on an ongoing basis, your biometric would be turning up to the bank. It would be making a phone call and the person at the other end recognizing who you are, and or the presentation of a check with your signature. These are all the kind of the old world equivalent, the old world ways of doing things. And all we're now doing is to try and find new modern ways in this digital world. But we've got a double problem, one of which is not just identifying you as an individual, but also the counterparty. Because whilst we solve the problem for one side of the equation, making sure that it's the right person that we're working with, the second problem is, are you actually working and looking to perhaps spend your money with or transact with on the other side of the equation? So there's a lot of problems to solve, and we're only just at the start of it. Our particular journey into this was very much along the lines of, as the internet evolved, we started off with just consuming content, but then allowing people access to it. So we wanted to know a little bit about them, perhaps an email address or a name, and at least validate that it was a real person. And then, of course, as we step up to today's world, where a lot of transactions are now moved online, well, quite often you've actually got to go through a very complex onboarding journey, which might involve taking a user through the validation of their mobile data, validation of their email address, taking them through a series of online forms, as the slide suggests here, where as people start to put information about themselves, which could be typed in or documents or passports, in the background, lots of different checks are being made with credit agencies, other attribute sources. So to partly explain the original question, which is where is all of this data held, part of the biometric will be held somewhere, but also one needs to understand that it's a very complex ecosystem, because things about you are also being held in other places. And quite often these journeys effectively help aggregate components about you from different places. So why is biometrics so important? Well, fraud is rampant. Fraud is one of our biggest enemies. We are at war at the moment. Our governments are fighting, obviously a medical challenge at the moment. But actually, I think we need to spend more time and money thinking about the war that our citizens, all of us on this call, are facing at the moment of theft. Not just of our money, but our identity, and even our pensions are at risk because people haven't properly sorted out the biometric, not the biometric, but the challenge associated with identity. And more interestingly, why biometric is of use is that all of the other things leading up to that, a username, a password, documents, in many cases they can be fraudulently presented. You can go onto the dark web and buy so much information about each other, and up until the point of the human presentation can be extremely fraudulent. So one of the big benefits of biometric is if you can create an onboarding service for, say, a bank or a relying party that can bind the individual into that process, wow, you've reduced dramatically the amount of fraud that could be presented in the system. Now, what's interesting for us is, again, a lot of our historical work has been based around creating identities, strong identities bound to biometrics with multi-factor authentication. So the presentation of that individual, whether it's me, Bob, or whoever it is, comes with a veracity of a series of claims that assert it's me. However, more recently, we've got involved in a project to do with COVID, and creating what could be a COVID vaccine passport or a test passport. Now, if we go back 6 months, for example, in the country with the track and trace, there's all sorts of challenges with the track and trace project because it potentially involved a lot of your identity, who you are, what you're doing, where you're going, who you're meeting potentially. And of course, for all the obvious privacy reasons, that was an absolute catastrophic nightmare of an affair to introduce people into. So we put together a project to try and solve a problem of how could you prove something about yourself without giving away anything about yourself. So on that, with that as the ambition, we teamed up with another UK company called iProve. I think they were briefly hinted at earlier, who actually are going from strength to strength at the moment. They just, in fact, 2 days ago, I think, announced a huge deal with the Australian government. So they're a real business doing real things and solving real problems. And one of the reasons we bound ourselves to them for that particular project was that there are two huge and independent applications for biometrics. One is to reinforce a strong identity, and the other one is to bind and present a strong entity. And I think one of the interesting things to go forward in time is to make that as a clear distinction for people, because in some cases, as talked about earlier with video cameras, at an airport, you present your face, it scans and it looks up in its database to see if it can find you. So it's searching its database for a record to relate it to the one that they've just captured. So when people talk about being scared about their identity or information about them being held and stored, that's one of the contexts which does get people a bit worried, because there is information held about you. Things like the company we're working with, iProve, they do entity verification, which means the presentation of your face, they scan it and they create a mathematical model, which if you were to break into the database, good luck to you. And even if you were to, there's no way you could reassemble that data back into a face. So it's a one-way traffic of information. The beauty of it is that when you present yourself next time, you provide another key, could be something else about you, something you know about you, something that's unique to you, and that plus the presentation of your face then unlocks the information behind it. And the beauty of that particular biometric story is that solves the problem of people's privacy, so they can effectively turn up somewhere like a pub. They don't need to know anything about you, your address, your age, your race, anything. All they need to know is that you're over 18 for that particular context. And that's where things like biometric products which involve entity verification become quite important. But equally, it can be used again to be used as part of the path of proving who you are after the point of presentation of say, account creation. So in the slide going back here, which is a typical slide or a typical journey now being used digitally for onboarding a customer for, say, a financial transaction, where they're trying to make sure that it is you. The point about this journey is that you then bind it to something about you, so that on the next slide, if I could ask for it to be moved on, it can be. Thank you very much. It can be used for business as usual. So in addition to perhaps a username and password, which again you could lose, somebody could grab hold of, the presentation of your face in that particular journey says to the place you're about to go that it is the same person who presented themselves the previous time. And remember, the previous time we actually bound it to an awful lot of information about you, which asserted your identity. Now, the interesting thing, again, with regards to biometrics and their importance is also about the context of engagement, the level of assurance required, the value of the transaction, the ease of use. Part of our history was working with BT on some of the biometric projects with the likes of finger vein. And what's interesting is that different technologies provide different levels of assurance, different types of biometric capabilities. Some are still in their infancy, heartbeat, and some of the new ocular technologies are starting to come into their own. Some need bespoke software and hardware, which obviously means that it's not ubiquitous. Others, like the likes of iProve, you can just use your mobile phone. So depending upon the context, cost, ease of use for the client, biometrics is here to stay. It's going to add more value into us moving into the digital world. But there's still a lot of questions and answers that need to be raised and answered. Specifically going back to the original question, which is, where is all of this held? Again, it depends on the context. It depends on who's running the ecosystem. What's interesting is that, like Richard, I'm also involved with the OAX, who are at the heart of creating and managing, or not managing, but helping help understand what the issues are relating to what are called trust frameworks, where you create environments where people will do business with each other, and what are the rules of engagement. And part of that is to understand consent for the user, what information is going to move from an identity provider to a relying party, and what are the security and the protocols going to sit behind it in order to provide the user with transparency of what it is they're engaging with and are signing up for. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Okay, it's now sort of open question time. So those on the lines, please feel free to either chat or tweet your questions. I've got a sort of first one, which I'm, I'll allow anyone to come in on. I mean, there was comment earlier about the government's announcement of increasing the NFC contactless amount to £100. And I know there's been a lot of comments from various people around the dangers of doing that from a fraud perspective. Do you think that the UK banks and card providers will actually, once they've embraced that upward change, start to actually move to including the likes of fingerprint technology on their cards or other types of biometrics?
Yeah, I'll take that, and then the others can comment. The short answer is yes, but the banks are going to be behind kicking off the economy, and contactless a limit increase is only going to help that, particularly, as I said, in the retail sector. There are going to be all sorts of different things. I think the industry is going to come up with. The finger sensor one is an important one. I can see that happening, and also the ability of to, and a number of banks do this, to close down your card via the banking app. So I'm sure we all are. I'm forever, leaving my card in a coat pocket or in my trousers. I forget where I put it, and all I do is really simple. Is I just go and close that card again. So all of that is going to help. I wonder if the others got some comments as well. If they came off mute.
Silence was the stern reply. Okay, I'll throw another one then into the fire, which is, how do we cope with false positives in biometric failure? And sort of in this time of COVID, I suppose I look at it and go, people's voice will change when they've got a cough or a cold. How do we manage voice biometrics with illness? And yes, I can see that we can say, okay, we'll go through.
Yeah, perhaps I'll pick up on that. So from our experience working with some different technologies over the years, there'll always be false positives. That's just the nature of technologies. The issue is about the context in which it's used. Does it matter? For some contexts, absolutely. For others, if it's about, say, somebody getting in or out of football ground, well, okay, so they've snuck in through the back door because of a false positive. What are the implications for it? If it gets bad, well, guess what? That technology doesn't tend to survive. Or it plays to a lower common denominator of access, where actually it's cheaper than something that with a greater veracity of claim. And it may be okay for contexts where, by and large, you've got a trusted environment, and if a few people slip through the net, so what? This comes down to individual organizations having to effectively scorecard every aspect of the onboarding. So going back, even to that previous slide where I talked about onboarding a client into into an account, there's still a level of assurance associated with that onboard. And each organization has to make its own judgment. So, even today, proving your address details is still quite a challenge, even by connecting to credit agencies. You may have moved.
Well, I can come in on that one and go, people say to you, we want proof of address, a bank statement, council tax bill. And you're thinking, I don't get those anymore. They all come electronically.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Oh, I moved recently, and it was almost impossible for me for one of my legal entities to prove that we had moved, because everything is online, and the bank statements don't even print your address on it anymore.
Yeah.
So we're nicely set up for failure. So the point I'm trying to make to answer the question is that everything is about a level of assurance, and each organization has to effectively impose or build their own scorecards to say, does this look okay? I mean, even historically, when you put in your bank details from a card, quite often a card ping will still come back with a score between 0 and 60, because when I use my card online, and it says put the name on it, well, I could put FF Joshi, F. Joshi, Frank Joshi. And so, even when it comes back looking at your bank card details, there's still an error component to it. But the whole idea is that across a number of tests, what's your level of assurance associated with it?
Yeah, no.
That's why I said it comes back to, actually, as you say, Frank, it's being able to manage the risk, but also from an architectural perspective, being able to swap in and out those different technologies as required, and also be able to navigate the different, as the level of trust in the technology evolves, being able to navigate that with the appropriate tools, which are understandable by the regulator, and not just by some back office techie. So I think also that visibility, that transparency, first of all to the regulator, and then and ideally in some sense to the consumer, is also going to be important.
I'm also in favour of a concept called hybrid biometrics, which depends on the level of risk that the merchant is taking. So you might have a fingerprint transaction that's worth up to, I don't know, say £500, and beyond that you might have an iris recognition kind of system beyond that £500, or indeed if either one of those fails, you would roll over to the other one. So I think we're going to see more hybrid solutions as we have to counter what's only, fraud is only going to increase, sadly.
Okay. I suppose from a payments perspective, the thing that's been our bugbear over the last 3-4 years has, within the likes of PSD2, has been around secure customer authentication. Is biometrics the answer? Is it part of the answer?
It's going to be one of the components. It's very much to what Matthew was saying. That's all about hybrid authentication and the scorecard that Frank was talking about. It's providing the principles that you need. What we're talking about here is biometrics. And it's not even one technology, it's a whole collection of different technologies, different types of risk, different mechanisms, which are going to be, you're going to swap in and out. And so in effect, it's just it's just one way for reinforcing that strong customer authentication.
I agree. And the challenge that I've got is that the powers that be pushing for strong authentication was great, but they were missing the point. It's totally irrelevant if the initial binding of that identity was poor.
Yeah.
Waste of time. They were looking at the problem from the wrong end of the telescope.
For Europe, that doesn't surprise me, but I will. Anyway, gentlemen, thank you for your comments and everything. I think it's about time we sort of started to close down. So what we'll do is go in reverse order and some sort of closing thoughts and observations. So, Frank, what's your view of the future?
I think so again, perhaps a couple of stories here. We're living in a world where, as an individual, most of our engagement is now online, especially with COVID. It completely, dramatically reduced, the face-to-face. So any process that involved face-to-face and paper exchange, you're going to see a dramatic move now to a digital equivalent. And a lot of, even government with things like for example, an example is the enhanced DBS check, which needs, in order for you to go and, perhaps help and support your local sports club as a volunteer, or going to, be a doctor or whatever it is, all of those paper-based processes have to be moved into the new world, especially where in that case, you had to physically present yourself to a person who was sponsoring you with all of your documents. So it's coming, the digitization. We're finding ourselves in a world where, we're losing track of usernames and passwords. The story that was told earlier about what happens when you're on holiday and you lose everything. You've got to be able to have a break glass recovery. And I think, good use of a biometric is going to be key in providing you with something that or something about you, because each time you present yourself, it's you. You don't have to remember your face. You don't have to remember your figure. You don't have to remember your eye. Hopefully it's there with you at point of presentation.
Yeah.
Has all the memories of what they've done around James Bond films with some of those thoughts.
Exactly. And also what's interesting about the biometrics is that, we've seen the movies of, where you a little blood sample is taken and your genetics are read, but of course you can then put a plastic bubble over the thumb. What's been interesting with the facial biometric is that the first version, people were putting high quality graphics up and they were able to fake them. Next, they were putting up 3D castings. They were able to fake them. And there's a constant battle for these technologies to keep up to date. But the likes of iProve are getting there, and they're winning the kind of contracts that they are. Others will fall to the wayside if they don't keep up, because again, whilst these great technologies emerge, guess what? There's a whole bunch of people there as part, they're testers who are the fraudsters, who will try as quickly as it comes on board to try and break it for all of the obvious reasons.
Thank you. Richard.
Okay, so I think picking up on, to a certain extent, what Frank was talking about, one of my concerns is that we're still working through what the use cases are for identity and how we're going to use it. At the moment, a lot of our models are based on the assumption that we're working with a single adult. But increasingly, we're going to have to think about how do we manage the identity of children, and what's the relationship they've got with their parents, and vice versa. So what responsibilities do the parents have for that child? I'm also seeing that, again, perhaps in terms of later life as well. So I think we're going to have some interesting challenges there in terms of how these systems work together, and just think about how identity, how you manage identity in that hybrid sense across your lifetime, or across an individual's lifetime. That would be, and tying it back into that risk scorecard again. I can't emphasize that is absolutely key to thinking about how things go forward.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the thoughts that sort of occurs on the back of that is how you manage changing circumstances. As an example, somebody is involved in a car crash or something, and part of their face has to be rebuilt. You now have to somehow have the capability to reconfigure that facial portrait within your identity scan, but to actually then have the veracity that says, yes, that is Bob Ford still.
Yeah.
But Bob Ford is different,
so
and how you manage it.
Just to pick up on that point, that's a bit like, the vouching. So, even I think till today, in order to get a passport, you have your photographs printed, and then you go to somebody of good standing who signs on the back of it and signs the forms. There's a personal vouch. What is interesting is that the latest documents from government about the trust frameworks that should evolve in society have finally recognised the need for good old-fashioned vouching. which is not too dissimilar again from the lawyer attesting to the fact that the picture is a true representation of the person applying for the passport. So in that particular situation of an accident, there has to be a way of that individual delegating authority potentially, because of course they may be incapacitated to do a whole bunch of things. But then when they want to reconstruct their identity, again through a vouch to say, yes, that might have been that person's face last time, but this is now the new version. And you have to do that through a human vouching service.
But you also need to do that from a historic, but you also need to maintain the historical information.
Absolutely.
So often with our current thinking around technologies, we would delete the old face and replace it with a new one. But we're going to need to track how the biometrics change, perhaps over 5, 10, 20 years, with all the changes in the technology as well. So it's a case of, we started off with MP3, or started off with spinning vinyl. The speed of the vinyl changed. We then went to 8-track, cassette, MP3, etc. And we've got to be able to manage it across that change of technology.
Oh yes.
Yep. Matthew, your closing thoughts, sir.
Yeah, so it's a very dynamic area, all of this, which is only going to increase, as I say, whilst we go through the renewal. But I'm a great believer in, there are a number of technical solutions out there. The UK's leading this, and actually the innovations don't only come from traditional markets. But if you have a look at the Middle East, so UAE and Israel in particular, South Korea in terms of the fintech and identity stuff is booming. And I got pinged the other day from an Australian outfit. So, it's a global problem that increasingly, global companies in whatever markets are beginning to crack. So I am optimistic about it.
Gentlemen, I thank you. I thank you, the audience, for attending today. We are looking at providing more webinars in the future. We'd like to revisit biometrics, obviously, but if you've got other thoughts of any other webinars that you think may be of interest in the payment space, then please, again, hashtag us with TPB webinar. There's the web address, there's the tweet address. I'd like to thank our speakers again. It was very kind of you to spare time today. And we look forward to meeting you again at our next presentation. Thank you very much all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bob, just to say on behalf of the payments business, thank you so much for undertaking a great job as moderator. And again, allow me to express my thanks to Richard Baker, to Matthew Key, and to Frank Joshi. It is a fascinating subject. And as you say, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to discuss given further regulatory requirements, the various hybrid solutions, and as all the panelists suggested, fraudulence. And on that, I found it totally fascinating. I think it was Richard or one of the panelists talked about the changing of facial recognition, or heaven forbid you have a car accident. With all the craziness going on in the world currently, it brought it back to me, sort of Jekyll and Hyde type scenario where these fraudsters could be doing all sorts of things. So very exciting, very interesting, and a little bit sinister in a way, but I'm sure a lot more to discuss. So again, thank you. As I say, there's a video and audio recording coming. For those attendees and delegates, we'd be delighted to welcome you as members and partners to the payments business. So do visit our site and look out for further webinars over the next few months, and particularly, I'm sure, on biometrics, which clearly is absolutely key. So I say to you all, thank you. And on behalf of the payments business and all my panelists, Bob Ford, our CEO, John Doyle, I wish you a good day a good afternoon, and those of you in the Far East, a very good evening. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.